So let's talk a little bit about financial planning as part of a rate study. So the costs that are recovered in a rate study include the following that are on this slide. We have operation and maintenance costs. These include things such as chemicals, salaries, utilities, supplies. We have to recover capital costs, which was called CIP in the video. These are big projects such as repairing pipes, tanks, pumps, treatment plants, wells, and so on. We have to recover water purchase costs. As mentioned earlier, the city buys water from Callegas and United. Those costs are recovered in a rate study. We have to fund reserves. These include an operating reserve and a capital reserve. And lastly, we have to recover debt service costs. When a city issues bonds, per the bond covenants, it must set rates to, in the city's case, to recover 10% more than its operating costs in order to meet bond covenants. And the city has 4 bonds plus a Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act known as WIFIA loan. So 4 bonds and a loan that it has to set rates to make sure it can pay back those loans. And all those costs together are known, if we use this term throughout the rate study, they're known as the revenue requirement. It's the amount of revenue to recover all expenses. If revenue is not sufficient, we increase the revenue by a required percentage, and that's known as a revenue adjustment. So in future meetings, you may see something called a revenue adjustment, and that's to make sure we're recovering your costs. During a rate study, we plan for reserves. These are typical reserves at water districts or cities. We have an operating reserve. All water districts or cities have an operating reserve. All cities have a capital reserve. A capital reserve is to ensure funds are available for large construction contracts. A typical capital reserve is 1 year of your typical or average capital expenses. And then in the second column from right, there's a column that shows whether or not the city has this particular reserve. So the city has an operating reserve, it has a capital reserve, it has a debt service reserve. And so when we set rates, we got to make sure that we're fully funding those reserves. 2 other reserves that are a little bit less common are an emergency reserve. The city doesn't have an emergency reserve. And a rate stabilization reserve. An emergency reserve is for natural disasters, an earthquake or something that just we weren't planning for. And then a rate stabilization reserve can be for lost revenue during a drought or a recession. But the city at this time does not have those 2 reserves. And this slide simply repeats, it says that when we're doing a rate study, you have to consider reserves and you have to make sure you're covering your debt to meet debt covenants.